2023 was an awesome year for movies. Out of the roughly 60 movies I saw this past year though, there were definitely a handful that stood out above the rest. My absolute favorites of 2023 will be what I talk about in today's video. I'm Zach Kircher, and you're watching Kircher Talks Entertainment. I think this past year's crop of great movies in particular holds greater significance to the larger cultural conversation than previous years had. Just take a quick look at all the different movie-related events that happened this past year. The majority of quote-unquote big blockbusters, particularly those released by Disney and Warner Brothers, were massive financial failures to levels rarely seen. Streaming services started to show the cracks in their business models, with these big studios dumping obscene amounts of money into movies and shows that people didn't care about, and then those same studios reaping what they sowed. And of course, the Writers and Actors Guild strikes led to what will hopefully be a net positive change for the entertainment industry, but we'll just have to wait and see. 2023 is definitely a year that film historians will look back on as a time when the Hollywood bigwigs started realizing that the old and new ways they had been doing things just aren't cutting it anymore. More of your average consumers are coming to the realization that their time and money just isn't worth the slop that Hollywood dumps into the trough. And that's important in a day and age when rent, gas, food, and pretty much every necessary purchase you can think of are more expensive, just like movie tickets and concessions are. And for myself, being a brand new father, I empathize more and more with the common belief that movies are too much of a luxury these days, both in terms of money and time. Now, the illusion of expense when it comes to movie theaters is something I'd like to get into sometime in the future, but aside from whatever I feel about that topic, the general public is not going to shell out a lot of money for the garbage that is only getting stinkier with time. That's why I think that the movies I'm going to feature in this video are so special, because while not all of them are examples of overnight financial success or groundbreaking innovation in filmmaking, they do help to refute the idea that there are no good movies anymore. More than that, if Hollywood is to learn any lessons from 2023, which they likely won't, they will need to look at the following movies and see why they were generally such massive hits with people like me. Without further ado, let's get into the list. Although I will first go through a lightning round of honorable mentions presented in alphabetical order. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is the subversive, emotionally resonant feminist text that everyone claims Barbie was. Beyond Utopia was just as much of a thriller as it was a documentary, which is to say that you should definitely check it out. Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves is basically the Princess Bride for the gamer generation. The Iron Claw is the most depressing movie of the year, but also one of the most fulfilling, especially for how it ends. May December was criminally snubbed by the Academy in a lot of categories, most especially for its stellar performances. At least the screenplay got nominated, which was rightfully deserved. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 is not my favorite installment in the series, but that doesn't stop it from being one of the year's best action movies. And finally, The Zone of Interest is a fascinating experiment on perspective that will leave one thinking more about the everyday horrors they are complicit in letting persist, as opposed to the film's direct subject, the Holocaust. Now that those are out of the way, let's dive right into my top 10. We'll start things off with Number 10! The highest compliment I could give to the fourth and hopefully final John Wick movie is that it's the installment that feels the most like a video game. That being a very well-paced game that offers a lot of variety in terms of action, tension, and the scenarios that the protagonist is put through. Sure, the scenes of talking that take place between the action are not as compelling, especially since Keanu Reeves gets worse at acting the older he gets, but this is the one movie in the series where the filmmakers fully understood what their audience wanted and how to give it to them in a way that makes sense from a pacing standpoint. Just like a video game, you get a set piece, some dialogue to provide context for what will happen next, the stakes are raised, and then another set piece starts. Rinse and repeat. You would think that this formula would get exhausting after nearly 3 hours of it, but it all culminates so wonderfully due to the never-ending sense of energy the film had, as well as how committed everyone in this cast and crew was to their craft. This is what you get when a team of people who love what they're making are given a budget to pull out all the stops. It looks eye-meltingly gorgeous, where if you're not being treated to an action scene that is choreographed with the grace and skill of a meticulous ballet routine, you're shown some of the best lit and most colorful cinematography of any movie released in 2023. Hopefully the clips you're seeing in the video demonstrate that, as bad as YouTube's video compression can be. The actors and stunt performers are also operating on a whole nother level here, demonstrating an insane degree of physicality and commitment in all that they do on screen. Each and every scene just kept topping one after the other as well, going from from the large-scale brawls in the Osaka Continental, to the nightclub fight, the Dragon's Breath scene, and then the hysterically awesome ascent up the stairs. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but it provides exactly what you'd want from an action movie extravaganza. For a movie franchise that was a Hollywood underdog from the start, John Wick Chapter 4 ending things off as the best of the bunch is really saying something.
Number 9!
2023 certainly was the year of corporate product biopics. I didn't even bother watching the supposedly falsified Flaming Hot. Air was decent, but rubbed me off the wrong way as the script stroked Nike's balls and made Michael Jordan out to be a golden calf for all of humanity to worship. And Tetris was a fun dramatization of the story behind how the titular puzzle game was brought forth from behind the Iron Curtain, but it was far from a great movie by any means. Blackberry though? That's what I call cinema, baby. I suppose the advantage that this had over its competition is that rather than being some glossy, overproduced commercial for a brand, Matt Johnson's comedic drama chronicles the rise and fall of a product that couldn't keep up with the times. Or rather, to be more specific, the hubris, greed, and poor insight that led to the BlackBerry's manufacturer falling on its face. What we got out of this story is one of the year's funniest and most dramatic films. I can really appreciate when a movie can tap into things like business and gamer culture in such a way that it makes for something very entertaining. The writing and direction are hugely important in that regard, particularly since the camera is always at a cold, almost documentary-like distance from everything we're seeing, so the audience is left to just watch everything play out as the company eats itself alive. However, it's ultimately the performances through which BlackBerry's strengths truly lie. I've never seen Jay Baruchel perform better in a movie, with him successfully aping his typecast role as an awkward nerd, while eventually transforming into an increasingly slimier corporate snake as the film goes on. But Glenn Howerton is definitely the standout as one of the most deliciously cutthroat businessmen in the history of film. No joke, I would have picked him to win Best Supporting Actor over any of the other guys who were actually nominated for that Oscar. He's that good, and his firecracker performance is emblematic of this film's great sense of energy. With a subject as dry as the rise and fall of the BlackBerry, you need to answer my key question that I always ask myself going into a movie like this. Does your movie do something that reading the Wikipedia page couldn't? Thankfully, everyone involved with this project showed up to work, making for a story that is just as informative as it is fun. In short, BlackBerry is that kind of movie that you scroll past 100 times on Netflix, only to finally watch it on a whim one day and regret all of the times you skipped over it without a second thought. Definitely don't skip out on this one.
Number 8!
For the last couple of months, when acquaintances at work and church would ask me what good movies I'd seen lately, Godzilla Minus One would always be my go-to answer. Really? A Japanese Godzilla movie? They would say, only for me to then say, Godzilla Minus One is a human drama first and a monster movie second. That answer is usually what got them intrigued, and it's still the argument I would make as to why this film was such a hit with both audiences and critics. After all, when you hear the words Japanese Godzilla movie, usually you would think of some schlocky B-movie where actors are punching each other in rubber suits. But not so with this latest film from Japan, for veteran visual effects artist turned filmmaker Takashi Yamazaki reined together a team with a minuscule budget and delivered an experience that puts the vast majority of Hollywood blockbusters to shame. And even though I'm not quite on the hype train as some other people have been, I truly mean it when I say that Godzilla Minus One hits with the impact of the big lizard whacking a skyscraper with his tail. Godzilla is an absolute force of nature in this, one that you simultaneously fear and can't wait to see wreck stuff up once he starts threatening mainland Japan. This truly sets the standard for what a big movie should be. Deliver the spectacle in a cinematic way, while not skimping out on telling a genuinely compelling story full of deep themes and memorable characters. That is what will keep me coming back to this movie for years to come, for while the action scenes are amazing, the heartfelt story of overcoming wartime trauma has longevity, the likes of which has great historical and emotional value. I, for one, cannot wait to add this to my Blu-ray collection and show more friends and family what I'm talking about.
Number 7!
The only unfortunate thing about Across the Spider-Verse is that it's clearly a part one of a larger story, so with it ending on a cliffhanger, it's hard to say whether it will hold up once the finale releases, whenever that happens. I also think that in comparison to its predecessor, I'm not as big of a fan of the writers doubling down on the hyperactive humor and occasionally awkward references to other Spidey universes. But those are small nitpicks in the grand scheme of things, for this is still a triumph of animated storytelling. I didn't think it was possible for Sony to top the innovation of the film that came before, but somehow they did that here with various art styles, frame rates, and character designs all operating together in individual images. I don't think the striking visuals had to be delivered at the cost of rough working conditions allegedly imposed by Phil Lord, but they are outstanding to behold nonetheless. There are so many positive things I could say about this movie, but you already know it's great. This is the exact kind of boost that the superhero genre needed when so many other movies faltered critically and financially, proving that the genre is not dead. We're just sick and tired of mediocrity. I love the mini renaissance that has come about for animation after this and the previous films released, and I hope the bar continues being raised for the medium moving forward.
Number 6.
Now, you might have been watching this fully expecting me to say that Godzilla Minus One was my biggest surprise of the year, but given how much my peers had hyped it up prior to me actually watching it, I can't say I was really surprised by how good it turned out to be. The first Slam Dunk, on the other hand, is something that I fully hoped to enjoy, but did not expect to love it as much as I did. Heck, it might just be one of my all-time favorite sports movies now. For one thing, this adaptation of the popular manga Slam Dunk, the likes of which was written and directed by the original author of said manga, redefines how cinematic basketball can be. The greater achievement in that is the fact that the championship game at the center of the story is animated with CGI, which typically looks horrible in anime. This might be the first instance I've ever seen where it actually adds to the experience, given that the characters are all well textured, their movements are fluid thanks to motion capture, and each frame felt purposefully storyboarded to maximize the energy on the court. An animated film is at its best when it achieves camera angles and movements that you just can't replicate in live action, and the first Slam Dunk uses that kind of cinematography quite often to place the audience right at the center of the action. It helps that the film completely leans into its shonen identity, with lots of great humor and teenage angst boosting the entertainment value. But ultimately, it's the human story interlaced between the scenes of basketball that glue everything together. After all, the championship game is split into little chunks across the whole runtime. In between, you get little doses of backstory and drama, the likes of which are animated with traditional hand-drawn images to feel more grounded to reality. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about the narrative itself, but it's got enough heart and emotional weight to give the centerpiece game some real stakes for the audience to get invested in. It's hard to say no to a well-told underdog story, and that's exactly what this is. Those who enjoy anime, like myself, will usually call certain movies and shows gateway anime to say whether it's something that people from all walks of life could get into. There are few better examples I can think of than the first Slam Dunk.
Number 5.
The crazy thing about my top 5 is that all of them are Best Picture nominees, which I think is a first for my annual rankings on this channel. While The Holdovers may be the most straightforward of those 5 films I've ranked, that doesn't make it any less worthy of being mentioned. In truth, The Holdovers being as down-to-earth as it is, works in its favor of being a Christmas movie. Not only that, I am perfectly comfortable calling this a new holiday classic, the likes of which I will probably end up putting on rotation with movies such as A Christmas Story and Home Alone. It doesn't harbor the same kind of easily digestible coziness as other Christmas classics, mainly because the screenplay avoids giving easy answers to the struggles the main characters face. I can't say that the ending provides much respite for those characters either, but those qualities are what I greatly appreciate about the film, since its emotional core lies in the connection made between people who feel neglected one way or the other. The holidays just provide this perfect window dressing for these characters to grow, care for one another, and overcome the obstacles that hold them back from their deepest desires. And it helps that on top of being a movie I felt in my heart, I also felt it in my gut due to its rich sense of humor. The dialogue is witty, the situational humor is often hysterical, and I couldn't help but be mesmerized by the lazy-eyed curmudgeon that Paul Giamatti turned his on-page character into. It goes without saying that he was acting alongside 2 wonderful actors who leave just as strong of an impression as him, with Divine Joy Randolph easily deserving the Oscar she will probably win, and Dominic Sessa was that rare amateur discovery whose natural talent pulled this whole story together. It's one thing when people say they don't make movies like they used to, but it's another thing entirely when people wonder why there haven't been any new Christmas classics in recent years. Alexander Payne and his team gave us a twofer with The Holdovers, so you can count on me recommending it to friends and relatives the next time Christmas rolls around.
Number 4.
Martin Scorsese continues to push boundaries and evolve the art of cinema, even as he pushes past 80 years of age. With Killers of the Flower Moon, he gave his own spin on what it means for something to be labeled as true crime. Now, with this particular movie being about the not discussed enough massacre of the Osage people in the 1920s, I can understand and even empathize with those who felt the movie was a bit lacking. After all, it focuses primarily on the perpetrators as opposed to the victims. On the contrary though, this choice worked for me me, since it seemed like Scorsese and co-writer Eric Roth wanted to dodge any sort of sensationalism in telling a story about killers, victims, and survivors. I can envision a version of this story where Molly Burkhart was the main character, and once the viewer sees where her story goes, they don't give what they saw any second thought. They would get the thrill that comes from depictions of real crimes, the suspense of wondering what ultimately happens, and then the emotional release of the ending. You know, because that's what you normally expect from true crime. Entertainment for entertainment's sake. Because we spend so much time with Ernest Burkhart and his scumbag Uncle William Hale, though, the film forces the audience to confront the subtle but deep-rooted evils that let things like this happen in the first place. Sure, it makes the 3.5-hour epic a rough watch, and maybe one that doesn't work for those with certain expectations for representation on film. But it is certainly a very compelling and artistically challenging approach that pays off in the end. And I really mean that, for the way this wraps up made for one of the best endings of the entire year, if not the absolute best. Don't be intimidated by the runtime, for this is an unforgettable triumph of filmmaking that calls for accountability regarding a bleak period in American history. And hey, if you are intimidated by the runtime, it's on Apple TV Plus, so you can split it across like 3 one-hour sessions if you feel so inclined. Either way, you need to watch this one.
Number 3.
Earlier in 2023, I made a video in which I argued that it doesn't really matter how long a movie is, so long as that time is used well. Anatomy of a Fall, which won the coveted Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival last year, is one such example of that. I say that because despite playing for 2.5 hours, this slow burn of a courtroom drama earns every second of the time it requests of its audience. And although I can understand why people are mad that Greta Gerwig wasn't nominated for Best Director for Barbie, I'm perfectly okay with French filmmaker Justine Triet being the female representative among the nominees, since her screenplay and direction are integral for why this works so well. After all, this isn't just your average murder mystery that gets argued over by lawyers and judges. Similarly to Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, the story is just as concerned with getting at the idea of truth as it is with telling a compelling and heartbreaking tale of a troubled marriage, the likes of which ended with the violent death of the husband. So much of this movie is focused on showing how complicated it can be to get at the whole truth of something, which is to say that one really can't, since the characters all harbor the truths that are evident to their individual perspectives. You see this play out with the main character that is portrayed wonderfully by Sandra Hüller, as well as that same character's blind son, who is portrayed just as wonderfully in an Oscar-worthy child performance by Milo Machado Graner. The visual language of the movie is just as effective at that as well, for things such as insert shots, flashbacks, and reenactments of events we've already seen help enhance the purposeful messiness of this whole dramatic affair. These scenes are cut into the film in the exact moments they need to be in order for the story to reach its richly meaningful point. To say that I was completely transfixed by this story is a gross understatement, for just as I was wrapped up in this story that kept evolving and embroiling itself in even more complex emotions, so was I trying to gain insight on how to be a better husband and father. Sometimes we forget that in the act of trying to escape the world by jumping into a work of fiction, we learn lessons that will stick with us long after the credits roll. I am only now just stepping into a new role that will define the rest of my life, so it's stories like Anatomy of a Fall that will help me know how I can be a better human in my everyday life. Due to the personal and artistic impression this made on me, I didn't hesitate putting this on my ever-growing list of the best movies of the 2020s so far, which, by the way, every movie ranked number 4 and above is on that list.
Number 2.
Much has been said about Oppenheimer these past months, and for good reason. It seems to be the frontrunner for Best Picture at the Oscars. The movie grossed a mind-boggling amount of money for the genre and subject matter it had. The physical media sales were unprecedented in an age where even Best Buy doesn't even believe DVDs and Blu-rays are worth selling anymore. And perhaps most important of all, it got audiences to care about seeing something genuinely unique in the cinema. But that only concerns the film's success when you look at it in objective terms. It's honestly astonishing that for a 3-hour-long movie that is primarily about theoretical physics and political discussions, it harbors a deeply human touch. Perhaps that's because despite the subject matter, the film taps into the universally recognized themes of betrayal, remorse, and self-interest, to name a few. I didn't expect to call Oppenheimer the most personal of Christopher Nolan's films, but after having seen this 4 times now, I really tapped into the choices Nolan made to filter the world through Dr. Oppenheimer's unique perspective. The film left me shaken to my core as it effectively effectively confronted me with this reality. Despite nuclear weapons being terrifying manifestations of power in and of themselves, what we should fear are the people who not only have, but desire the ability to push the button. That's why I could appreciate this movie's focus on the many discussions before and after the bomb came about. For one thing, it allowed for the year's most stacked acting ensemble to shine as they all performed expertly together. But through the stunning visuals, the now iconic score by Ludwig Göransson, and the sound design, seemingly mundane conversations are energized with the urgency of a thriller, which helps the pacing tremendously, but mostly acts as a means of emphasizing how society has doomed themselves. Needless to say, whatever sorts of points Christopher Nolan wanted to make through his movie, he sure did hit them. It's a mesmerizing, utterly compelling step forward for filmmaking, while also a terrifying reminder of what humanity is capable of. If Nolan was to ever make a horror movie, I think Oppenheimer is hard evidence that that would really be something. Despite how great Oppenheimer is though, it can't top the emotional power of what ended up being my absolute favorite movie from 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, that movie is... There's a single line from this film that sums it up perfectly, as well as why I feel so strongly about it. If you leave something behind, you gain something too. I may not have emigrated from my home country to start a new life, but I do know what it means to think about my life choices. There hasn't been a time in my life more applicable to that feeling than now, with me having become a father to a little baby girl. It's perfectly normal to feel guilt, cringe, sorrow, or whatever negative emotion you can think of when dwelling on the past, but most especially when you enter a stage of life that you can't turn back from. This is what makes Past Lives so special to me, for in the act of portraying life in its plainness, deep truths about the human experience become evident in the characters shown on screen. All the while, there are beautiful conversations had between people as a camera fills the screen with gorgeous images of New York, and a score reminiscent of the stuff played on the Lo-Fi Girl channel pervades the sound waves. It's a very cozy viewing experience that kind of feels like the Before trilogy condensed into a single movie that spans 24 years. Coming from me, that is extremely high praise. More than any other set of characters in 2023, Nora, her husband Arthur, and childhood crush Hae-sung felt the most like relatable human beings, and I loved every second watching them interact. It's one thing that the actors all did a terrific job, with John Magaro's Arthur quite possibly being one of the greatest husbands in the history of movies, but the characters' journeys all feel universal, despite their different backgrounds and unique circumstances. And then going back to that earlier point I made though, Past Lives hit me so hard, specifically because it showed that it's okay to love the life you have, while also dwelling on what could have been. I'm perfectly happy to go on through life with my loving wife and my daughter, along with any other kids we may have in the future. We share similar goals, our basic needs are met, and we feel hopeful for all that lies ahead. And yet, despite all of that, I can't help but feel sad sometimes about relationships I had messed up, or things I let go in the pursuit of something else. The ending of this movie drives that home with immense emotional power, the likes of which understands the depth of what it means to be human. It's a sad tale, sure, but one that remains hopeful that anyone can find happiness, whatever life they choose for themselves. And that, among many other reasons, is why Past Lives is my favorite movie released in 2023. And that's it! Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and leaving a like on the video. For doing so really does help my channel, and I will see you all in the next one.